Welcome back. We're here again for another kind of deck breakdown here of decks to see in Atlanta and Blue Steel, Zoolander, whatever you want to call it. Sapphire, Steel, kind of ramp, mid-range, wherever the die is cast on the naming convention here. That's where we're going with for today. So this has been kind of a deck we've seen integrated since set 1. Different variations of it have kind of popped up over the length of its play. And this is the latest version, I'd say. A deck that plays very similarly to a few decks. As we'll notice here, a lot of decks are kind of mishmashes of each other. In a lot of ways, this one steals some from Ruby Sapphire and some from Amber Steel and kind of meshes them together in that way, kind of giving us its own unique archetype. And yeah, here's the general game plan of what this deck does. This one is another Whole New World deck. The first one we've gone over, but not the first one we've seen in the experience of Lorcana as a whole. Using insane cards like Fishbone Quill to help power up an abundance of ink to really utilize Whole New World and all the cards you draw off of it much faster than your opponent. But that's not where we start. We start off here with the baseline of the deck. We actually have Captain Hook and Mr. Smee, kind of the 1-2 punch on both the aggressive game plan and the controlling kind of game plan. Both are very good at challenging opponents' characters. 3 strength on both sides makes them, pretty much able to take down anything you'll see on turns 1 through 5 pretty efficiently. Mr. Smee kind of course, staying in play through its self-damage drawback with Captain Hook in play as a captain we see. But those two offer a 1-2 punch that, when combined with some of the other 2 lore characters we see, actually can help propel you further in your game plan to kind of close things out. And next up, the kind of character roundout we have. Mickey Mouse, just an acceleration piece when you don't have cards like Fishbone Quill or One Jump Ahead. I've chosen to include both. I think a lot of people say play only Mickey Mouse and no One Jump Ahead, but in this explicit metagame, I think you want to be hyper consistent with your acceleration. And if you happen to have a Fishbone Quill, then there's no real reason to play One Jump Ahead. You can kind of just ink it with its ability at any point in time, but having that consistent acceleration really is what you're looking for when going second. And again, for the Atlanta Challenge and the Lille Challenge, you're going to have to go second in half your game. So the added consistency is really something I'm looking for in a lot of my decks. And that's kind of where I settle on for this variation of it. Belle, strange but special. Certainly strange indeed, but strange we haven't seen more of it, actually, is what it comes down to. While you're not really looking to play this in early game on turn 4, its combination with Lucky Dime, which is really the card that gave Sapphire new life in a lot of scary ways, to be honest. It is hard to interact with, object in play. Once it's an item down, it makes everything threatening if it's not immediately answered. Making cards like Belle instantly 5 lore, which having to wait a full turn is the drawback in a lot of sense with Belle, or play it early and then hope to get to 10 ink. But Lucky Dime just making it instant 5 lore is incredible. And the reason Belle is in this deck is to double as an acceleration piece when the late game comes around, or if you happen to miss on your early One Jump Aheads or Fishbone Quills or Mickey Mouse, or if you're just looking to empty your hand of some of your more expensive cards to then Whole New World, Belle's perfect for that kind of thing. But primarily its function in this deck is to pair with Lucky Dime to be 5 lore all at once and to put the game away really quick. One of the key things to do against Lucky Dime decks is always make sure that they're below 15 lore. 14's the last safe point there, where only Tamatoa can really take over and go from 14 up, which can happen, but we'll get to that one in a moment here. But yeah, one advice to play against any kind of Ruby or any type of Sapphire deck is to keep them below 15 lore if possible, because Lucky 9 plus Belle is a combination of cards which is truly terrifying. Being able to just gain 6 lore or 5 lore out of nowhere is a lot to handle. But really the card that's made Sapphire tick, and a card that is so good, it's definitely in the top 10 of the game, period, even now, even in set 4, is Harem Flavor Sham. It is a 4-cost inkable, for some reason also inkable, 1/6, that when you play it or quests, you can sacrifice and you can banish an item to draw 2 cards, combining with Popsicle, which is a 1-cost item that just draws a card, has some other text for removing damage. But really, the 1/6 helps fuel Sapphire. From set 1, we saw a lot of people trying to play Ruby Sapphire because that color pair made a lot of sense, because it had a lot of access to really good removal. And the issue with Ruby Sapphire is it had no card draw. So in set 1, we saw a lot more of the Steel Sapphire because it utilized Whole New World really well. And that is what drove its kind of card advantage, along with Beast Mirror at the time, which was a more acceptable piece to accelerate with, and not accelerate, to draw cards with than it is now, because of how swingy the game can play, and playing off the top isn't really what it used to be. But Harem Flavor Sham changed all of that in the previous set, making this deck really something to be reckoned with, and it continues even in set 4 because we have another popsicle type effect, which is really the key piece to those two things being in the same set. And both drawing cards gave Sapphire this huge engine to kind of run through and make them really the item faction, which is cool. But it's a devastatingly powerful card draw engine that really a lot of games will come down to how many times they've activated Flavor Sham, Harm Flavor Sham, and how many times you're able to answer it right off the bat or not. The key piece to the deck, it makes everything tick. Even when you don't have Home to World, you can still draw a bunch of cards, and if left unanswered, there are instances where, against some decks where you don't want a Home to World, you just use Home to World for Ink from Fishbone Quill's ability, and kind of eschew just having to give your opponent cards altogether, because Flavor Sham will draw a bunch anyway for you and kind of live on. But yeah, 6 health does make it vulnerable to Maui, but that's where we see kind of our next piece, Cogsworth here, Grandfather Clock. One of the only decks in the game that utilizes a Cogsworth, and unfortunately Cogsworth might be pushed out of the metagame next set, but for right now it's pretty good. Giving resist to all your characters kind of doubles as a captain for Smee. The self-damaging part of Smee being the drawback is kind of eliminated when it has resist 1. And Cogsworth is something that a lot of decks, especially steel decks, whether it be Amber Steel, Emerald Steel, those are really the two we see. And even in mirror matches for Blue Steel or Sapphire Steel, you see Cogsworth being an incredible tool to just lock people out of the game. Having Ward and giving else resist makes this more of a kind of an item than an actual character in play, but one that can't be killed by item hate. You kind of never quest with this, or this is a perfect card to help set up future Home Worlds because it's so hard to remove outside of effects like Be Prepared and Lady Tremaine, which Lady Tremaine's on a big decline in favor of Medusa. So that's a kind of a key point to this deck that this has a bonus of. But this card's seriously giving the effect of consistency. Being able to sing a Home World the turn after you play it is a huge part of why Cogsworth play, along with doubling as a 2-lore quester when the time is right, and a way to give Smee the ability to live through a bunch of hate or a bunch of damage-based effects, and his own self-damage effect makes Cogsworth one of the perfect cards. And one of the cards we've seen up and down tick of here and there, backwards and forwards. I think people have loved Beast Tragic Hero, I've hated Beast Tragic Hero. It's a really tough card to evaluate in a lot of instances because it is so good if left unanswered. However, the amount of Ruby Sapphire decks and other decks, Ruby Amethyst we see in decks prior with the Beast being vulnerable to Madame Medusa, not Lady Tremaine, really gives it an insane target on its head because you need to play this card ahead of schedule in order to make sure that even when going second, you don't lose your Beast immediately to a Medusa and you at least get one card out of it. Beast is an insane card to help run away with a game, especially against some of the Emerald Steel decks, which is why I think it's going to be included. And against Emerald Amethyst and Emerald Steel, Beast in play is one of the best cards you can have. It helps generate an advantage, and certainly Emerald Steel can damage it. They have a lot of, the Storm Rage on and Strength of Raging Fire, even along came Zeus. But the fact that Beast, if unchecked, wins the game a lot of the times is one of the main reasons for its inclusion. Even against Ruby Sapphire, sometimes you have to just cross your fingers and hope it works out. And against Amber Steel, you also sometimes cross your fingers, hope it works out. Beast, if unchecked, is going to win a lot of games. And it's one of the best top decks when you're both in top deck mode. And yeah, I think it's still worth inclusion, even though I've seen a lot of people remove it from their builds because of its vulnerability. And this deck can heal it too, much like Amber Steel can heal it with Rapunzel. This one has Popsicle. And Popsicle, when it's not doing duty with Flavor Sham to grind through and draw a bunch of cards, can heal up your Beast in a pinch and really help you kind of move forward in the game. It's exceedingly good against, I'd say, Ruby Amethyst, the deck we looked at prior, just because this deck can play it ahead of schedule often with Quill and One Jump Ahead Mickey Mouse. So it gets in well before Medusa would take it out, unlike Ruby Sapphire, which can kind of match your acceleration pieces, which could be a problem. But yeah. Next on the card choice here, Tinkerbell Giant Fairy. This deck utilizes Tinkerbell and Grab Your Sword as its primary ways to remove characters or remove boards. The big trade-off between this deck and Ruby Sapphire is the lack of Be Prepared. They're very different cards and different ways you have to play around this kind of deck, whether you're playing a deck that cares a lot about large creatures, small creatures, a lot of creatures, a few powerful ones that are resilient. This deck is a little bit weaker to some of the other steel decks, and even against Ruby Sapphire, you have a hard time dealing with some of the bigger cards like Tamatoa, because you're not playing the Ruby removal spells, which are so good in mirror matches like that. But Tinkerbell is one of the best cards in the game, and one of the best cards you kind of get from playing this archetype over Ruby Sapphire is the ability to answer things like Curse Merfolk and other 1 cost or 1 health characters with Grab Your Sword to complement that, to take out a lot of the threes. This combination of cards makes you much better against the aggressive decks than Ruby Sapphire is. You kind of gain the Captain Hook, Smee, and Tinkerbell aspect of the game with Grab Your Sword, where those things are coming down much quicker than cards like Be Prepared, and much more difficult to take a Tinkerbell out of hand than it is to take a Be Prepared. So that's really the trade-off between this and the Ruby Sapphire decks, and one of the reasons I think this deck's good. You get to beat up on some of the more aggressive decks while still having that late game plan that they do of Tamatoa or Bell with Lucky Dime. And Tamatoa is a card I've seen very few people play of in this format with Blue Steel, but I think is a necessity, because out of all the decks that kind of utilize Lucky Dime, which really there's just the two, this deck and Ruby Sapphire, Tamatoa is the key piece that really makes it inevitable. It makes destroying a Lucky Dime almost irrelevant half the time, because if you're spending a full turn to remove it, it's really hard to justify doing so when you know they can just Tamatoa it back. So having access to Tamatoa later in the game is something I really do like. And of course, it being an inkable card, it's pretty easy just to move around, but there is something to be said about the inevitability of Tamatoa against not just Ruby Sapphire, because that one can be a little bit tricky, but any kind of mirror match or any kind of deck that isn't really going to be able to pressure you out too early and you want to just grind. I mean, Tamatoa is just the best top end that Sapphire offers, really. And it's a card I would include for certain if I was playing this deck. And I think a lot of people could adapt, because at the worst, it's often going to be just returning a Popsicle to your hands, which isn't bad. I mean, it's just a card that replaces itself. It's a big threat that demands specific answers, whether it be a Be Prepared, Tremaine if the situation's correct, but it's kind of hard to Tremaine when you have deck with Mickey Mouse and Captain Hook and stuff. But yeah, Tamatoa is a worthy inclusion and something I would definitely be. I've seen people play Simba, the 7-cost Simba, which is kind of like a midway between a Tinkerbell and really just it's like a weird Tinkerbell that kind of survives some other things. But I'm a big fan of Tamatoa, and I think I would include it for sure. Baboom, early removal, mainly to deal with the early aggressive cards like that we see out of Emerald. It can take out cards like Cinderella and Robin Hood, or anything that can be shiftable out of Amber Steel. Baboom, just a nice catch-all, and we've seen Fire the Cannons be good, but this one being inkable is just a huge benefit. Inkable cards are always going to be better than uninkable cards as far as context of flexibility, which is why we see next up a card like Rise of the Titans be played. Harkening back to Emerald or Ruby Amethyst in the previous video, we saw maxing out on Queen's Castles. Queen's Castle is an incredible card, especially against steel decks, because as you can see, this deck actually can't challenge too well. Outside of Captain Hook and Mr. Smee, the next time you have anything that has any significant amount of strength is on 5. And locations can be a big problem for this deck, whether they be McDuck Manors, which I don't really like in general, but mostly Queen's Castle against the Emerald Amethyst decks and out of the Ruby Sapphire decks. Rise of the Titans can double in matchups there to help take out cards like Lucky Dime, Fishbone Quill, but primarily dealing with locations is one way to lose the game. And of note, Baboom can also hit some of the locations if you're able to put some damage on it and then finish it off. But Rise of the Titans is just a clean answer to all of them, and being able to, again, double up and kill a well-timed Lucky Dime is pretty important in a lot of matchups, and again, being inkable is just nice in general. Why I think it's a 3 of, for sure. There's no Benjas and Beasts, 5-cost Beasts that banishes as an item because of the need for the ability to answer locations, I think. You could play some number of a mix of them, but I think you want to be more focused on your own game plan than answering everything out of your opponent. Being the proactive one and the reactive one is really where it lies. The other one next up is One Jump Ahead. I think I mentioned briefly part of the acceleration package, but again, in a best of 2 where you're playing 2 games or 2-game set, however you want to describe it, you need to win every game. That's really the goal of it. You need to. Our guesstimation for how the event's going to go is you need to be 5 2-0s, and then the rest can be 1-1s, I believe. But in any case where you lose, you owe 2 once to make the cut to day 2. I think it might be 5 or 6 2-0s. But you need to win a lot of games going second, and One Jump Ahead's a card that kind of catches you up in that instance. While Mickey Mouse can kind of do that, but turn 3 might be too late against half the decks. It might just be too slow. And One Jump Ahead is vulnerable to cards like Ursula going second, especially where you want One Jump Ahead. But it's a risk you kind of have to take. And I think being able to catch up and propel you later into the game earlier on is a key reason to play this type of decks, where you kind of have to make sure you get to this point of the games consistently. And while Fishbone Quill and Mickey Mouse, you can play more Mickey Mouses, might just not be enough. And you might need to do something on turn 2, where one of the best draws you can do is Popsicle on turn 1, One Jump Ahead on turn 2, and then Flavor Sham on turn 3. That is a very proactive threat. to develop there, helping you get a steady flow of cards, and makes your future Fishbone Quills even more devastating as they propel you even further into the game. Being able to play 2 cards that cost 5 in a turn or something like that. Just the earlier you can start 2 spelling in a turn, playing 2 things out each turn is where you're really going to find the sweet spot of this deck and where you're going to pull ahead. We have a couple smattering of removal spells here. Along Came Zeus and Let It Go. Along Came Zeus is fine. It answers most things early on, and you could see swapping out Zeus for a card like Smash just to help answer Ursula early on, the Deceiver of All. And other things that you want to just take out that can't be hit by Ursula. Deceiver. Deceiver is the 2 and Deceiver of All is the 3. But Along Came Zeus I think is pretty perfect and helping deal with opposing Tragic Hero Beasts, as well as some of the bigger threats that you can play out maybe in conjunction with a Tinkerbell attack and a shock. It's a flexible removal spell that you can always ink with a quill. Let It Go being something you usually don't want to use unless you have to, but it can be incredibly powerful at the right time. Really a concession to dealing with opposing cards like Tamatoa, or anything else in a pinch it can take care of too. But really, its main focus is cards like Tamatoa and Cinderella Stout-Hearted against Amber Steel. Just have to hit something, and sometimes it's just the best thing to do because it's unconditional. It doesn't care how much health it is, doesn't care what cost it is, how much strength it has, or anything like that. Just kill it and done. But yeah, that's the smattering of removal there between Baboom, Zeus, Let It Go, and of course Grab Your Swords to combine with Tinkerbell to deal with most boards. The previous couple of videos have shown that decks like Ruby, Ruby, Amethyst, Ruby, Amber, and Emerald, Amethyst, the sweet spot is 3. Most cards in the game kind of have to have 3 health if they cost above 2, oddly enough, because Grab Your Swords is so threatening, and you need to play it just to have it and force it, and it's really at its best when combining with Tinkerbell, or late in the game you define 2 copies of it when you're home rolling a bunch. Help clear the board. It's one of the tests of the game, and it's still worth including, even though everyone's kind of prepared for it. Popsicle is an egregious card in my opinion. I don't really like that it exists, but it's a very good card in general. Of course, just being a cantrip item that you pair with Flavor Sham to just draw a bunch of cards. You need it, and Fishbone Quill might be again in that top 10 discussion for best cards in the game. Accelerating you while making use of your uninkable cards later in the game to help get you to those points where your powerful late game spells are all good is just incredible. And comparing one of the ways to get ahead of decks like Ruby, Sapphire is to have 2 Fishbone Quills going with the whole new world. You can kind of dictate how much ink you have, and I've been in games where I've had 16 ink to their 7, and they've tried accelerating a bunch anyway, and just 2 Fishbone Quills with Whole New World is a whole nother level above what Ruby Sapphire can do, and one of the reasons to play this type of deck is getting that huge amount of advantage to maybe Tamatoa back a Lucky Diamond and immediately activate it, or just get to that point of the game where you're answering their threats and playing out a threat of your own every turn, and making sure that their Be Prepared are never going to put them ahead, but only kind of reset the board to where you're still advantaged. So Fishbone Quill, Whole New World, a tale as old as time from set 1, pairing together to give you huge amounts of ink advantage, even more so than Ruby Sapphire can do. And Lucky Dime being the finisher of choice. I don't think you could play more than 2. I certainly would like to play 3, but I don't think it's reasonable to do so with the uninkable count being what it is already, and how clunky they can be at times. Of course, this deck has a high number of uninkables, but I've grown to accept it in some decks where there's a lot of acceleration. It's still not my preference to play this many uninkable cards in the deck. How many is this now? This is 2, 5. What do we got? 14, 16. Okay, is it 16? I think it's 16. Somewhere on there, but it's a high number, and Lucky Dime is definitely at the top of it, and it can be stuck in your hand early, but you never want to keep it. You always want to draw into it late game, and it can be part of your winning game plan. But of note, this deck is eschewing cards like Develop Your Brain for more, again, streamlined of a deck. You want to you can play cards like Develop Your Brain, however, they don't do anything. I think people misplay that card a lot, where I'd rather have more copies of the cards that I actually want to play than shaving some numbers here and playing some develops to find the right one at the right time. I'd rather just be more threat dense, and Develop Your Brain can be seen as a threat because it can find one piece or the other, but when it comes down to kind of raw deck count and what your deck does, Develop Your Brain is a little bit of a liability in that sense, and I've never been a big fan of it in these type of decks since Popsicle was printed, but it's also a card that people misuse a lot, and I think that I would not play it because I'm just hoping in a lot of cases to run really well in this event. In Atlanta, you kind of have to get lucky. That's part of every game. It's a combination of luck and skill, but you do need to get lucky. And drawing the right pieces when they're relevant and giving yourself more powerful cards in your deck. You almost have to remove Tamatoa to make room for Develop Your Brain to have the same amount of consistency and pieces you want. And I'd rather just have the bigger threats in my deck at the time. So that's the explanation for no develop your brain. It is a conscious choice, something I've made over the course of this format, and yeah, I like this deck. There's a lot of pieces for it. I think that it might be a little bit not as positioned well as some of the other Sapphire decks, mainly Ruby Sapphire, because of Be Prepared and how good it is, and how many people are essentially are playing to beat it, in a sense that they are just hoping their opponent doesn't have it when it comes up. And Grab Your Sword and Tinkerbell are a good way to combat that, and this deck definitely is better against decks like Emerald Amethyst than Ruby Sapphire is, but I think you give up a little bit of points in too many other categories there to really make it worth it. But this is what I play if I was playing Blue Steel. It is a strong deck, has a lot of powerful cards, and suits a lot of people's play styles pretty nicely. It's been around for a bit, different variations of it, and yeah, this is what I would go with if I was playing this deck in Atlanta. But thanks again, everyone. We're going to come back to another video, another day here, making sure there's 2 at a time up until Atlanta. So this is going to be, we're on Tuesday now, so tune in tomorrow, Wednesday, for a couple more. We're going to go down the pipeline of what I think about the 7 decks you can really play. So see you all then. Until next time.